I Hate Politics is a podcast dedicated to exploring a human activity we love to hate. We look at human life, culture, and economics closest to us in our neighborhoods, workplaces, schools and streets, and in our local governments. Together, we will explore how politics is central to getting things done in societies where we treasure diverse views and preferences. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. I've spent my life studying politics, and I know this. Unless we want to live in a dictatorship or monarchy, we are stuck with politics. Politics is more than Trump, Biden, or elections. It's how we fix potholes, make our streets safer, where we put our schools, and decide who goes to them. It's about coming together as a community. It's about us. Let's go find those stories. As Montgomery County wrestles with attracting new businesses and residents, Jacob Sesker, a former county budget analyst and now consultant, proposes a $275 million jobs fund to incentivize businesses to bring high-paying jobs to the county. He will describe and defend his proposal, which to me raised the age-old question about the role of government in the economy. Should the government provide infrastructure, including in these days education, and then let the market play out? Or should the government provide selective incentives to specific economic actors, think Amazon, to relocate to the county? Both approaches have theoretical heft. Government as a provider of infrastructure is a central tenet of Adam Smith's writings. Selective incentives as a way of ensuring collective action and public good comes most emphatically from the work of Manker Olson, who spent a considerable amount of time close by at the University of Maryland. The incentives approach is particularly salient for local governments. Unlike the federal government, which has some degree of policy monopoly, local governments compete with each other as businesses bargain for the best deal. In response, Montgomery County State Delegate David Moon, for example, has been pushing a state bill to create an interstate compact so local governments in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area do not compete with relocation incentives to attract sports teams and other businesses. But why not infrastructure and incentives? Given this kind of choice, most political leaders prefer all of the above approach. But that misses the point. If we do need both, then, assuming scarce resources, we have to explain the balance of spending between the two approaches. In economist terms, the question is, where should we spend the marginal dollar? Sesker's report was paid for by Empower Montgomery, a nonprofit that is run by key players in the real estate industry in the region. Music for this episode comes from Seth Kibel, a Washington, D.C. and Baltimore-based woodwind specialist, music producer, and arranger with an astonishing range from blues and jazz to klezmer and reggae. He performs with several bands, including the Alexandria Klestet, Bay Jazz Project, Music Pilgrim Trio, the Natty Bow, and is the winner of 28 Washington Area Music Awards. Songs for this episode come from his 2017 album, Seth Kibel Presents Songs of Snark and Despair, which he wrote in response to the 2016 presidential elections. I'll be back with the news roundup. COVID fears are back. The Delta variant has produced breakthrough infections. Even the vaccinated are not safe. With less than 2 weeks to school reopening, concern about elementary school kids who are not yet eligible for vaccinations has escalated. What MCPS will do isn't really clear. Central office directions and what school principals say can vary quite a bit. MCPS decided to mandate vaccines or testing for all adults, but there is no solid testing plan for students. It isn't clear either what or how quarantine rules will be enforced. Presumably, a positive test will take the case out of MCPS's hands and into the hands of the Department of Health and Human Services. MCPS closed applications to its virtual academy sometime now, and it remains to be seen whether the district will expand enrollment with growing Delta variant cases. In the middle of all this, the county's chief health officer, Travis Gales, has decided to resign, and the state and county health departments will have to conduct a search for a new leader as it manages the school reopening. It is unclear why Gales decided to leave. He has been under considerable pressure from the state government and even from Maryland Governor Larry Hogan personally, and has received considerable hate and abuse, including much of it racist and homophobic, over his decisions to close the county and the school system. Gales has been the face of Montgomery County's lockdown for the last 18 months, and with him gone, expect increased policy uncertainty. Worth noting that Washington, D.C. and other regional school systems are in a similar place of unpredictability and difficult coordinating parts as well. The City Council of neighboring Greenbelt pushed forward a ballot referendum on reparations for African Americans and Native Americans, one of the first to do so. If the referendum passes, Greenbelt will establish a commission to study what reparations could look like. Greenbelt is a New Deal era federal government-led housing development that specifically disallowed non-whites from owning homes there. A separate black Greenbelt had been proposed but was never built. The state of Maryland's Department of Transportation, which operates the state's interstate highways, has started a new program for metering vehicles as they arrive on the ramps of I-270. There are no tolls yet. This is just a traffic management system that will use entry gates to control and manage traffic flow on the highway. Be careful as you drive. Watch for chain signage. Montgomery County's first community solar project will go online in September. Funded by the county-chartered MC Green Bank and private financing, the solar panels have been installed on the roof of a Housing Opportunities Commission, that is county-owned building in Silver Spring, and expected to serve 91 households while saving them about $500 in annual electric bills. I can't round up the news without mentioning Afghanistan. Maryland and the Washington, D.C. area have long been a resettlement location for Afghan refugees to the United States. The stories of those I know have been heartbreaking. As a new wave of refugees lands in Dulles and BWI, we would do well to remember that these new members of our community helped us first. I'll be back with Jacob Sesker, who is proposing that Montgomery County create a $275 million jobs fund to attract new business to the county. Jacob Sesker, welcome to I Hate Politics.
Thank you. It's nice to be with you, Sunil.
You wrote a report arguing in favor of a $275 million jobs fund. Can you describe the report?
I wrote a report that outlined several of the key challenges that the Montgomery County economy is currently facing. In particular, a real decline in the share of high-wage jobs that are coming to the region that the county has been able to land. So, most of the growth in industries that pay high wages has occurred elsewhere, and we're continuing to sort of see a westward shift of the center of the region's economy, and that is leaving Montgomery County, to some degree behind. That has some real implications in terms of the actual amount of revenue that's available to fund critical services that both meet the needs of current residents and also meet the expectations of the body politic generally, both including just general citizens, but also people like public employees and so forth who have expectations about the way the county government's going to spend its money, in terms of both level of service and level of salary. So there are some real challenges associated with a declining rate of growth in high wage industries. At some point, you do run up against a sort of natural limitation in your ability to continue to attract the sort of residents who work in high wage jobs if they're not able to actually get to an office that they need to go to at some, within a relatively reasonable period of time. It certainly can create challenges for the sort of stores and restaurants that we like to have in specific parts of the county. Their ability to continue to provide amenities and choices and opportunities for people in those communities are limited by the fact that there's a relatively low daytime population in the communities that allow them to sustain themselves. So those are among some of the examples of ways in which job growth is actually important. Leaving aside the fact that commercial real estate, is a big driver of county revenues. It's not the only driver of county revenues, and certainly, unlike counties in Virginia, Maryland counties, benefit significantly from the income tax revenue associated with the residents. But as I said, at some point you do run into a challenge in terms of how many high wage earning residents you can attract if there aren't any jobs close by.
Why is Montgomery County seeing this decline?
Well, I would say it's a couple of things in particular. One, the industries that pay high wage jobs and the industries that we tend to target from an economic development strategy standpoint, face choices in the region, in particular between Maryland and Virginia. I do think like DC sort of is in its own, weight class here in the region. But as between Maryland and Virginia, there are some really significant differences from a tax structure standpoint. And one of the things that I highlighted in the report is that among 4 companies in these, key strategic high wage industries, the net tax level in Maryland is significantly higher than it is in Virginia.
Hold on a minute. I have heard Mark Eldridge say that that's not the case, that this tax burden, the total tax burden in Virginia and in Maryland, particularly in Montgomery County, is similar, is not that different. Is he wrong?
Well, Mark likes to focus on the property tax. And he's correct that Montgomery County's property tax rate is in some cases lower than the property tax rate in Northern Virginia jurisdictions.
But why is that not a relevant matter?
Well, because the difference is that in Virginia, the property tax makes up a much larger portion of their overall own source revenues. Whereas in Montgomery County and in Maryland generally, the income tax is a really significant driver of income of local revenues, and the full range of local own source revenues in Maryland is just significantly wider. So one of the things that I showed in the report is actually, how much higher on a per capita basis the tax burdens are in Maryland, compared to Virginia.
But from a business point of view, when you're calculating your tax burden, you're including all taxes, property, income, sales, whatever it is, right? And so if you take aggregate taxes, is there a difference between Virginia and Maryland?
There is, yeah. The overall tax burdens are higher in Virginia or higher in Maryland than they are in Virginia. And also just the nature of what those taxes are, it plays out relatively differently. You also have a corporate tax in Maryland that you don't have in Virginia. You've got a local piggyback that you don't have in Virginia. You've got estate taxes that are different. So, from on a fundamental level, some of the difference between Maryland and Virginia taxes comes down also to who is paying those taxes. It is just generally more expensive to be rich in Maryland than it is in Virginia. And the sort of people who are making decisions about where to locate companies are often influenced by that.
So is your argument primarily that Virginia does the stack taxation better than Maryland and makes it easier for rich people to locate there?
No, not at all. First of all, I would just say I think that there are a lot of great policy reasons to have a progressive tax structure that, of the sort that Maryland has. But I think that you do have to sort of recognize, if that is placing you at a competitive disadvantage, that that's something that you need to address. Furthermore, I would say that there are other issues that are affecting the location decisions. A significant one is, in fact, just that there's very little new development in Maryland. It may very well be true that if a person needs a new size 12 shoe, that there are size 12 shoes out there somewhere for them. But what you probably want is a new shoe, and you want one that looks like a certain way and that actually fits your foot. And the same is true in real estate. Honestly, there's a huge difference between having there be some vacant space in an old building in North Bethesda somewhere or South Rockville versus having brand new space in a brand new building, with the tenant fit out budget somewhere in Northern Virginia. And that has proven to be a problem both in terms of the office market and in terms of the retail market in Montgomery County. There is just not enough new space to accommodate people who want to make new investments.
Okay, but why should the market not take care of that? I mean, if there's demand for new buildings, then the market should be able to support that. And if it doesn't, then it doesn't.
Well, it's a regulated market. So we place all sorts of costs on development, including, impact taxes, other entitlement related costs. And in addition, I would say the development process is significantly more challenging in Maryland than it is in Virginia. There are a lot more opportunities for, there are sort of more approvals. There's more public input in terms of what goes into those approvals. And there is sort of a sense that the negotiations with the community never end in Maryland, and that makes it very difficult to actually develop, and have sort of a healthy pipeline of new office buildings and new retail environments in Maryland.
So public input and democracy impede the process of development.
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, obviously, it is important to have a community that reflects, where the built environment reflects a vision that the community shares. And, that all of that is incredibly important. But at some point, you do kind of need to be able to cut off discussion and say, this is a project that has essentially done everything that we've asked it to do, and now we need to allow it to go forward. If that process takes, significantly longer in suburban Maryland than it does in suburban Virginia, then that's going to put us at a real disadvantage. And frankly, there are for some specific products where there's a lot of investment right now, and one that I'll point to is data centers. That sort of like build to suit ground up, like you start it now and it's done in 9 months, like that can't happen in Maryland. And what is happening instead is that all of that investment is going to Northern Virginia. Places like Loudoun County, it was able to reduce its property tax rate by 5.5 cents last year, in large part because of the significant amount of investment in data centers.
That's interesting. So why do you think this difference exists between the quality of the character of public input in Maryland versus Virginia? What is the root here?
That's an interesting question, and it's not one that I'm necessarily sure that I can provide a great answer to, other than to say, we have a really interesting land use culture in Maryland. It's you roll up your sleeves. It's a full contact sport. It often gets very bloody, and bloody in a way that it doesn't in many jurisdictions in Northern Virginia. Certainly, some of that I do think has to do with the fact that Northern Virginia, the body politic is more diverse in its sort of general view of the market. And I think it's sort of politically more purple. And that has, it does lend itself to, on some level, perhaps a more business-friendly set of land use policies, and maybe a more business-friendly, just general community. Though that's not true universally throughout Northern Virginia. And certainly, some of the closer in areas in Northern Virginia have a very similar sort of, attitude towards new development that you see in Montgomery County. I would say, Alexandria certainly is one that comes to mind.
Arlington.
Yeah, Arlington as well. Yeah.
Why do you think Amazon went to Virginia, not to Montgomery County?
Well, without getting into Amazon's, I'm going to, make it a little bit more general than just Amazon. I think Amazon and many other, recent corporate location decisions in the DMV have been driven by real estate. And it really is about, where is there a project that's in the pipeline? Where is there a project that's in the pipeline that's next to an existing empty building, or next to a building that's near completion? And, in the absence of a healthy development pipeline, it is difficult to make the case to somebody who, say, wants an entire office tower, that you're going to be able to accommodate them in the time frame that they need to be, in which they need to be accommodated. In particular, if the development approval process is something that takes several years. So if you're a company that is, say, looking to move from Pittsburgh or Chicago or North Carolina to the greater DMV, and you're looking to do that in 3 years, 3 years isn't necessarily going to get you to site plan approval in Montgomery County. So, let alone, the sort of, additional 24 months or something like that it's going to take to get a project, once it has all the approvals to completion. So that is a significant challenge. And I think, the Amazon transaction is one where, leaving aside the question of sort of like, what was the county's offer on the table? You have to be able to provide an incentive that is both competitive in terms of the other incentives that are being offered in the region, but also that acknowledges the broader context in terms of the cost of doing business in those jurisdictions. Again, Montgomery County and Maryland, wonderful places, tons of great assets, tons of things going for them. But land cost is not necessarily cheaper than it is in Northern Virginia. Overall, taxes are higher. As I indicated earlier, some of the specific types of taxes are specific types of taxes that are less favorable to businesses and the sort of people who make location decisions for businesses. And you have a much more challenging overall development environment.
The reason I brought up Amazon is because Amazon has this sort of divergent analysis about it, right? So the reason Amazon went to Virginia was because, one set of reasons is the pipeline, real estate pipeline issues, the permits issues. But the other one, which is a big one, I think, is that Virginia Tech and the investment that was going to go into Virginia Tech. So investment in education was a big driver for Amazon in the eyes of a lot of people. So oftentimes, we know as policymakers that everybody has to do everything, but we are really talking about the marginal dollar here, the balance between, investing in education. You're suggesting a $275 million jobs fund that'll essentially go to real estate developers. Why not take the money and put it into education?
Well, first of all, whether or not it's just going to be going to developers or not is sort of a, that's a whole separate question. But the $275 million investment in education, I think that if the real question here is, is it about incentives versus education? I guess I would say a couple things. One is, spending additional money on education doesn't necessarily mean better educational outcomes, though it may just simply mean more compensation for the same school system employees. Secondly, I would say the tail, the amount of time it takes for that to sort of bear fruit from an economic standpoint is significantly longer than, what might be needed just in order to like stanch the bleeding, essentially, like, in a period where you're coming out of a recession. And then I do think like there's another issue, which is that, what Montgomery County needs right now is success, the sort of success that begets other success. So, in Virginia, just to use, education as an example, the state and the county in economic development and in education and in infrastructure spending seem to be generally, rowing together in Northern Virginia. And that's not necessarily always true in Maryland. I think, leaving aside where somebody stands on I-270 widening, as an example, or things related to educational investment. There are just very different choices that have been made at the state level in Maryland, in terms of spending money in locations other than Montgomery County. Montgomery County tends to get a relatively low share of the amount of money that it sends to the state back. The flagship university is in, Prince George's County. Obviously, the Purple Line and connecting that flagship university to downtown Bethesda and downtown Silver Spring is something that, has some really like significant economic development potential for the region, but it's not done yet. And it hasn't borne any fruit, to date. And it's not really clear that Maryland and Virginia are rowing together generally in terms of the state of Maryland and Montgomery County aren't necessarily rowing together when it comes to infrastructure spending or school spending. So, all of those things, like having been said, absolutely, like having a pipeline of highly educated, people, having a university that has a campus and has, a relevant programming. That was all part of Virginia's value proposition, and it's a significant part of Virginia's value proposition. But in order to get there, that didn't just sort of like happen in, the middle of the last decade. It was something that was built over many years of, the state of Virginia and Northern Virginia jurisdictions sort of viewing their economic development future similarly.
Well, so there is a matter of choice, right? I mean, $275 million is not a small amount of money.
Look, the tax code is complicated, and it is used to shift spending and burdens around all the time. If what you're seeing in the way that the economy is reacting to your tax code is that it's reacting poorly, then I think you have to decide whether or not you want to tweak the way, the relative tax burdens under your tax code in order to be able to generate more revenue. That revenue is absolutely critical if what you want to do is be able to provide, say, better education, and lead to better educational outcomes for Montgomery County residents. And I think that there's a real shared value there in Montgomery County, that is what we want to accomplish, is better educational outcomes for all students. That's a sort of a defining characteristic of the body politic in Montgomery County. And it's a wonderful, shared goal for a community to have. But in order to get there, you have to be able to pay for new buildings. I estimated that the amount of money that has been sort of left on the table by not continuing to attract the same share of growth that the county had attracted previously is about $275 million, which is roughly the cost of 2 high schools. If we've got capacity problems in our school system, then one way that we can address that is by having more money available.
But we don't have capacity problems in our school system. In fact, what the problems we have in our school system is that it is unevenly distributed. Overall, the system we have capacity. I mean, there are 10,000 kids overcrowded in 100 of our schools, and there are 10,000 kids enrolled open seats in the other 100 of our schools. So that's a problem. It's not an overall capacity problem.
Right. That's an allocation problem and a political problem.
Right. Could you outline what specific incentives you have proposed in your report?
Right. Yeah, I've proposed two separate incentives. One would be a jobs-based incentive. So in order to be eligible for these, you would need to be a company that provides on average, that pays on average salaries in excess of $100,000 a year. And certainly there are many industries where that is the case. Where many employers do pay more than $100,000 a year on average. And one of those would be $15,000, up to $15,000 per job. And then the second incentive program is one that is tenant improvement based. And so this would be essentially, the first cost that somebody has when they're trying to take on a new lease. And one of the big sticking points in any, lease negotiations is, how much of the cost of fitting that space out and furnishing the space is going to be amortized into the lease by the landlord. Because it is actually, a really significant expense when somebody's moving into new space to finish that space and furnish it. And one of the, so the other part of the incentive program that I recommended is a $50 allowance per $50 per square foot for tenant improvements for Class A office space and $25 per square foot for Class B office space. And this would offset a significant portion of the upfront cost that is being borne by tenants, though oftentimes borne by tenants, through their lease costs, if it gets amortized by the landlord, which would make Montgomery County rents lower, and a little bit more cost competitive with neighboring jurisdictions.
Can you point to any jurisdiction in the region or even broadly where these incentives have actually worked?
Well, first of all, incentives are being used and are working all the time, and they're being computed in different ways all the time. Oftentimes the way that they're being computed is less transparent than this. So, Montgomery County, just to be clear, Montgomery County and every jurisdiction in the region right now sort of has a sense of what the going rate is, right? Montgomery County and the state of Maryland are willing to pay a certain amount for certain types of employers. They're willing to pay more for employers who are coming from outside the region than they are for employers who are already here.
What is that rate? I mean, if this is a general knowledge, then what is that rate?
Let me just point to, the most recent County Economic Development Fund report indicates that the county on average in recent years has spent around $3,000 per job generally, and that the state leverage is about 2.6 to 1. So the state's spending about $8,000 per job. So, those numbers are going to be sort of in the midpoint of a range, that are around which you probably have companies getting smaller incentives than that to stay in their existing space, and companies that are growing or coming from outside the region maybe getting, larger incentives. But just generally speaking, those incentives in Montgomery County and in Maryland have been lower than what Virginia has recently been willing to pay to attract the sort of high-end office users who are occupying entire buildings.
We pay about $8,000 right now. You're suggesting $15,000. Right? Why 15,000? I mean, obviously 25 would be better, but why not 12? I mean, how do we determine where that sweet spot is to be able to have the impact that you're looking for?
One of the things that I was looking at was what have some of the recent incentives from the state of Virginia, which generally, in most Virginia incentives, it's entirely or almost entirely state level incentives. And those have been higher. They've been in the $15,000 to $23,000 range per job. And in Maryland, as I said, between Montgomery County and the state, it's been closer to 11,000, I think, on average, right? So, and as I said, on average, I mean, obviously you can drown in a stream in a half an inch of water on average, a stream where
I understand.
is half an inch. But in general, very few incentives in Maryland have come in at anywhere close to that. So the idea was to create a program that was essentially, providing an overall level of incentive that was higher than what has been successful in Virginia. And the combination of the $15,000 per job and the TI improvements in combination is more generous than what Northern Virginia has been offering. And while there are some real benefits to having an economic development incentive playbook that nobody else has seen, when the broad business and investment community isn't really seeing the value proposition that you're offering, sometimes a good idea is to make it a little bit more clear. I think Prince George's County, as an example, 10 years ago, the county executive announced a $50 million economic development incentive program. And in fact, Prince George's County over the last decade has outgrown Montgomery County in terms of private sector job growth.
Well, that's not surprising. We are growing from a much higher base. So the growth rates are going to be different.
I mean, if you're not surprised by the fact that Prince George's County has gained more private sector jobs than Montgomery County, then that's certainly one data point. But I would say, if you think that, for example, that the quality of schools should be driving, economic development outcomes, then, many people would say, well, the quality of the schools in Montgomery County is significantly higher. How is it that Prince George's County is able to attract more private sector jobs?
Part of the problem here is also that we don't have affordable housing.
Absolutely. That is a huge problem for sure. On the other hand, we do more to require affordable housing than most places in the world.
But it ain't working, is what I'm saying. I mean, it ain't really working. We try. I mean, there is lots of effort, but the MPDU system really doesn't work. At least in my mind, in the way that it's supposed to. There is a huge shortage. I mean, 40,000 units in the entire region in Washington, D.C., of which I think 10,000 are in Montgomery County. So we have a housing shortage problem, and people don't come here because they don't have housing.
Yeah, I mean, again, like certainly that's a problem, but like once again, you also do need to have jobs for the people who live in that housing to be close to. And that certainly has been a problem. I mean, I literally have clients in the real estate industry right now who are telling me I'm having trouble financing my multifamily project because people are talking, when I go to talk to underwriters, they're saying, well, the people who would work in this building are going to work in, who would live in this building are going to work in Reston. How much do you think they're actually going to be willing to pay to live in this location and commute to Reston? And they're questioning, the fundamentals of some of those projects, saying, I'm not sure that you're going to actually be able to achieve these rents. I'm not sure that you're going to be able to achieve, be able to retain tenants once you land them, because there aren't enough jobs close by.
Well, so, Jacob, you said at one point that, throwing money at schools does not necessarily ensure better education results, right? Why not work on streamlining the permitting process, the approval process? Why not fix those things rather than throwing more money in an incentive scheme at, development? And why would it work now?
Well, I think money always works. I mean, look.
So money always works for education too, right?
I think if what you're talking about is spending money on, schools in specific locations, if you're talking about spending money on developing specific programs, if you're talking about spending money on building school facilities in places that you need school.
No, I'm talking about a cause and effect relationship between, how much we spend and what product we get, right? And so you propose that spending money on education is not necessarily does not necessarily produce better education outcomes. And I think, you, I will take that solid. I mean, that's a good case to be made sometimes. But also, why is that the solution then on the development side? Why can't we fix the zoning? Why can't we fix the permitting process? Why can't we fix the approval process? Why can't we do the things that does not require money? And why do we have to go the money route for when it comes to development, but go the fix the process route for education?
Well, look, that's a great question. I mean, look, I think part of it is, the politics there are really complicated, right? So if you think that you can solve the permitting problem and the planning problem and the sort of like land use blood sport problem in Montgomery County, then more power to you. I would say that, a lot of efforts have been made over the years to streamline the development process. The county executive currently has an effort to streamline the development process, which he worked on with the planning department, the speed to market initiative, that I think is probably going to, improve marginally some development review times on certain types of projects. But we've been looking into how to streamline development and make the process work more efficiently for years. I mean, on some level, it's a little bit like infrastructure week at the national level, right? You can talk about infrastructure. It sounds great. It seems like something that everybody can sort of get behind. But, in the reality is that there are a lot of vested interests in having a land use process work the way that it works. And there are a lot of like specific communities, some of which are, very powerful geographic communities and socioeconomic communities in the county that really don't want to see improvements to the development review time for commercial development projects.
Well, I agree with you. Actually, I agree with you 100%. And in the trouble I have with this whole sort of conversation, the approach is that there's a cause and effect problem. If what is causing our problem is the regulatory system, and we are trying to alleviate the regulatory system by providing more selective incentives, right? And so we're just in this race to the bottom with who gives more money to corporations, and then we have people will say this is corporate welfare in many ways. And why do we have to do that? Why isn't there an alternative way? And why shouldn't our political leaders be held to account for not resolving the root causes?
I think the reality is that, in Montgomery County, you're operating in a system where, as I indicated before, the state and the county aren't necessarily rowing together. The public employee unions have a really significant voice in the way that local politics and local spending is done in the county. You've got relatively little competition in primaries, for in the sort of general marketplace of ideas. And you've got generally those things both locally here in Montgomery County as they do anywhere else lead to situations where you've got politicians who represent a relatively small segment of the community, and maybe increasingly represent a small segment of the community. If 15% of the people in Montgomery County are turning out to vote in local elections, or whatever the number is in an off-year election, that's a relatively small set of the overall body politic, and that is the set that is driving the decisions that are being made by the politicians that they elect. And those politicians, many of whom are my friends, are make all sorts of difficult decisions all the time, but they make those decisions within a context and in an environment that is heavily skewed sort of in one direction. And having some more significant employers locate in the county over the next couple of years is absolutely critical, I think, to changing the discussion about what the future of this county is going to look like. It's absolutely critical to being able to generate the revenue that's going to be needed to invest in the sorts of things that this community really values, including education. And it's going to be absolutely critical to making sure that the discussions that we have about growth and development in the future are balanced in a way that allows there to be, a more a broader conversation about, changes to the development review process and the master planning process and the adequate public facilities ordinance and things like that, in a way that maybe is going to sort of better reflect the views of all Montgomery County residents, and also better enable this county to facilitate growth and opportunity and prosperity for a wide range of people.
Well, Jacob Sesker, thank you. I feel like I have to say, to be continued. What lessons can we draw from my conversation with Jacob Sesker? First, Montgomery County appears to be in some trouble figuring out how to continue to grow economically. While historically the county used to be a bedroom community for Washington, D.C., Southern Montgomery County in particular has become its own economic engine, and this engine may have stalled after 2 decades or so of significant growth. Consequently, local politics, which traditionally used to be about education, police, and roads, now includes understanding the levers of economic development. Second, Jacob Sesker is correct. The root causes of the problem that make Montgomery less competitive than Northern Virginia counties are immensely hard to know, let alone resolve. Some of the problems in Maryland's case lie at the state level. Note that it is the state in Virginia, not local jurisdictions, that offer incentives to businesses. Further, why it takes longer, or at any rate, why does the business community feel it takes longer to go through the development process in Montgomery County is unclear except for some generalized grievance about governments and politicians, which also exist in Northern Virginia. It could very well be that businesses, when they present in Northern Virginia, are making exactly the same complaint there as well. Jacob Sesker's solution is to fix the here and now, put out a bunch of money, attract some businesses to locate here, and then maybe deal with the root causes later. Or perhaps the root causes won't matter at all. Hard to argue with that, really, except that this type of thinking is one reason why so many people hate politics. Sesker's plan does look like corporate welfare to those who oppose it, and they will see it more important to fix the process rather than throw money at the problem. Third, domestic economic development in the U.S. is seen as a qualitatively different problem than international economic development that includes the uplift of poor countries. But one insight from international economic development is perhaps useful. Foreign aid, the equivalent of selective incentives internationally, has seldom succeeded in jump-started economic growth. The vast consensus in that literature points to the importance of good governance in economic development. It is what the World Bank and IMF expect third world countries to do in order to continue to access grants and cheap loans or selective incentives. It may be time now to do the hard things. There's a plan, device you. That's all for this episode. Music for this episode comes from Seth Kibel, a Washington, D.C. and Baltimore woodwind specialist, music producer and arranger with an astonishing range from blues and jazz to klezmer and reggae. He performs with several bands, and is the winner of 28 Washington Area Music Awards. I say this every episode, but we'll say it again. I'm very much looking forward to showcasing local talent and especially local music students on the podcast. If you want to share your music on the show or know someone who might want to, please email us at ihppod@gmail.com or reach out on Twitter at ihppod. I hope you will subscribe and share the show as we bring you stories about politics close to you and your home. See you next time.
Tend to our own little garden of peace and of joy. Tend to our own little circle of love. Raise up our children with hearts overflowed with compassion.